soldiers slept during World War II. Now, I will tell you about the main secrets of survival, which will surely seem unusual to you, and some may even shock you. Sleep is a basic human need, inherent in us by nature. But what happens when this need conflicts with the harsh reality of war? On the fronts of World War II, sleep turned from rest into a tactical task, from a right into a luxury that had to be earned. Soldiers of all armies, finding themselves in inhuman conditions of constant tension and fatigue, were forced to invent amazing ways to trick their own bodies. They learned to sleep standing up, shared minutes of slumber among themselves, and turned steel helmets into makeshift pillows. It was a quiet, invisible war, a war with their own bodies for the right to forget themselves for at least a few moments. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how soldiers literally slept with their eyes open, and why the ability to fall asleep instantly in any position was valued on the front lines no less than accurate shooting. What I am about to show you is prohibited in 12 countries as a guard duty instruction, but in war, it saved lives. A soldier's main enemy in the trenches was not only enemy bullets, but also sudden drowsiness. A sleeping sentry is a death sentence for the entire unit, so the soldiers developed a system of collective sleep that was ingenious in its simplicity. Instead of one or two people staying awake while the rest slept, a small group in a trench or dugout shared not only time, but also space. Each soldier was responsible for his own narrow sector of vision. This allowed the other fighters within that perimeter to lean against the wall of the trench and sink into a shallow, sensitive sleep. The system worked on absolute trust. A soldier could afford to relax only because he was firmly convinced that his comrade had his back. This invisible bond, woven from shared fatigue and danger, was stronger than any regulation. Even in sleep, the soldier remained part of a single combat organism. His body rested, but his subconscious continued to work, ready to wake up at the slightest rustle or signal. It was a sleep on the verge of reality, a thin film between exhaustion and combat readiness. This organization of rest allowed the unit to remain combat ready for days on end. Soldiers changed roles every half hour or hour, giving each other the opportunity to reboot their nervous systems. These short periods of sleep were worth their weight in gold. Interestingly, the system was not prescribed in any official manual. It arose organically as the only correct response to the conditions in which people found themselves. It was folk military wisdom, passed down from veterans to recruits. Even a short sleep in such conditions was a real challenge. The cold, dampness, uncomfortable posture, and constant sounds of battle prevented complete relaxation. But even such a nap was a salvation that prevented the body from giving up completely. This system of collective security transformed sleep from a personal matter into a common task. The survival of the entire group depended on how clearly each person fulfilled their role in this complex mechanism. The rest of one was the responsibility of another. This is how true military brotherhood was born. It was forged not only in attacks, but also in these quiet, tense hours of shared vigil and sleep. Soldiers shared their last piece of bread, their last bullet, and their last minutes of precious rest. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think that such total trust in your comrades can be considered the main element of survival in war? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Want to know the secret that allowed soldiers to go almost without sleep for weeks? In war, time flows differently, and the moments of calm between shelling or during a long march became an invaluable opportunity to rest. In these conditions, soldiers of all armies perfected the art of cat sleep, the ability to fall asleep instantly, in any position and for any length of time, whether it be 10 minutes or 40 seconds. This was not just dozing off, but a developed skill, vital for preserving sanity and strength. A soldier could doze off leaning against the cold wall of a trench, sitting in the back of a shaking truck, or even during a short stop on the march. The body, pushed to the limit of exhaustion, used every opportunity to shut down. A soldier's brain learned to work in energy-saving mode. It shut down all secondary functions, leaving only those areas responsible for hearing and reacting to danger active. Therefore, such sleep was incredibly sensitive. Any sudden noise or change in the environment instantly brought the soldier back to reality. Physically, it looked like complete detachment. A soldier could sit with a rifle in his hands, his head bowed to his chest, and appear petrified. But this was not weakness, but the highest degree of self-control and adaptation of the body to extreme conditions. The ability to quickly switch off and just as quickly switch on was a kind of talent. Experienced veterans could sleep for 5 minutes during artillery preparation and wake up a second before the command attack. This skill saved the nervous system from complete exhaustion. Such short breaks for sleep did not provide complete rest, but they allowed soldiers to recover their strength a little. They relieved the acute feeling of fatigue and allowed soldiers to maintain their concentration. It was like quickly rebooting a computer, after which the system is ready to work again. Soldiers found the most incredible places for such sleep. They slept under tank tracks, in shell craters, in tree hollows. Any place that offered even the illusion of shelter instantly turned into a temporary bedroom. This skill was not innate. It was acquired during the difficult trials of the first weeks at the front. Realizing that there would be no more normal sleep, the body found a way to survive. It was a cruel but effective school of adaptation. The ability to sleep in fits and starts became as important a soldier's skill as assembling and disassembling an automatic weapon. It did not earn medals, but it gave something more valuable: the chance to live another day. Ultimately, the war was not only against the enemy, but also against relentless time and fatigue. This experience proves the incredible sacrifices and changes the human body is capable of making in order to survive. But what if I told you that soldiers learned to sleep even while standing, like horses? Read on to the next chapter to find out how they did it. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of frontline soldiers, which was not written about in the newspapers. When there was no opportunity to even sit down and fatigue literally knocked them off their feet, soldiers resorted to the most extreme method of rest: sleeping while standing. It seems impossible, but for an exhausted body, there were no barriers. This practice was especially common during long shifts on duty, on guard, or in crowded dugouts, where there was simply no place to lie down. The soldier would find a point of support: a trench wall, a tree, or a comrade's shoulder. He would shift his weight onto this support, bend his knees slightly to find balance, and allow himself to switch off. The rifle often became a key element in this process. The soldier would rest the butt against the ground and lean his hands and forehead on the barrel and bayonet. This created an additional third point of support, turning the person into a kind of stable tripod. Such sleep was shallow and restless, more like a trance or meditation. The body was at rest, but muscle tone was maintained to prevent falling. It was an incredible demonstration of the brain's ability to control the body even during sleep. Sometimes soldiers used straps or ropes to literally tie themselves to a pole or tree. This allowed the muscles to relax a little more without the risk of falling. Such scenes might seem strange, but in war, there was a logic to it. German soldiers on the Eastern Front in winter practiced sleeping standing up, huddled together in a tight group. They leaned on each other, maintaining not only balance, but also precious warmth. It was a living sculpture created by fatigue and cold. The duration of such sleep was short, usually no more than 15 to 20 minutes. But even this short interval gave the nervous system the necessary respite. Upon waking, the soldier did not feel rested, but at least able to continue performing the task. This skill required training. At first, the body resisted, but after a few days or weeks of exhausting wakefulness, it gave in. Sleeping while standing became as commonplace as cleaning weapons or digging trenches. From the outside, it could look frightening. The figure of a soldier frozen in an unnatural pose in the middle of the night landscape seemed ghostly, but it was not a ghost, but a man pushed to the limits of his physical capabilities. Sleeping while standing was the highest form of soldierly asceticism. It was a rejection of basic comfort for the sake of duty. It proved that human willpower could force the body to obey orders even when all its resources were exhausted. What if I showed you a time machine that would transport you to life in the trenches? When a soldier had the opportunity to sleep lying down, it was already a huge stroke of luck. However, the reality of the trenches offered neither beds nor mattresses. Beds had to be made from whatever was at hand, and in this matter, soldiers' ingenuity knew no bounds. The main element of a soldier's bed was an ordinary greatcoat. It served as both a mattress and a blanket. Soldiers spread one half on the ground and covered themselves with the other, creating a kind of sleeping bag. If possible, soldiers would fill empty potato or sugar sacks with dry grass, straw, or fallen leaves. This created an improvised mattress that provided some insulation from the cold and damp ground. It was a real luxury, not available to everyone. A duffel bag filled with personal belongings was most often used as a pillow. However, the most common and multifunctional item was a steel helmet. It was turned upside down and placed under the head, sometimes covered with a piece of cloth for softness. They always tried to make their sleeping place as safe as possible. Soldiers dug a small niche, a foxhole, in the wall of a trench or dugout. This recess protected the sleeper from accidental shrapnel and drafts. In winter, the bottom of the trench or dugout was lined with fir branches for additional insulation. The needles not only protected against the cold coming from the frozen ground, but also gave off a light resinous smell, reminiscent of peaceful life. It was a small detail that had enormous psychological significance. To protect against rain and snow, a raincoat tent was stretched over the sleeping area. This simple piece of canvas became a roof, walls, and door all at once. It created a tiny personal space in this world open to the winds. Which of these items of military life do you think was most important for survival? But even the most comfortable bed was useless if there were fewer sleeping places than soldiers. In the next chapter, you will learn about the system that solved this problem. In conditions where space was as scarce a resource as time, the hotbed system was born. This term came from the Navy, where submarines often had 2 or 3 times fewer sleeping places than crew members. But on land, in cramped dugouts and bunkers, this principle took root just as successfully. The essence of the system was simple. One sleeping place was used by several soldiers in shifts. When one soldier went on duty, he woke up his replacement. The latter got up, and the soldier who had come from his post immediately lay down on his still warm, hot place. This conveyor belt of rest allowed the maximum number of people to sleep in the minimum amount of space. There was no such thing as a personal sleeping place. The bunks in the dugout were a shared resource, operating 24/7. Psychologically, it was difficult. The lack of personal space, even something as basic as one's own bed, weighed heavily on the psyche. Soldiers had to sleep where another person had just been lying, breathing in their scent. But in war, you get used to such things quickly. The opportunity to sleep lying down in warmth and relative safety outweighed any inconvenience. A hot bunk was much better than sleeping sitting up in a cold trench. This system required iron discipline and a strict schedule. Guard changes and rest periods were strictly observed. Any failure in this mechanism could leave an entire unit without the necessary sleep. Sometimes the bunks were so hot that the soldiers joked that an entire platoon could sleep on one bunk during the night. This dark humor helped them cope with the harsh living conditions. It was as much a part of survival as the shift sleep system itself. Ready to learn about the secret weapon that allowed soldiers to stay awake for several days? When it was no longer possible to trick the body, soldiers resorted to a last resort: stimulants. It was a desperate attempt to borrow energy from their bodies, to postpone sleep until later in order to survive in the here and now. The most common and legal stimulant was caffeine. Strong tea for British and Soviet soldiers and hot coffee for Americans were not just drinks. They were strategic resources that helped soldiers stay awake during night watches or exhausting marches. Thermoses with hot coffee or tea were as important a supply item as ammunition. A hot, sweet, and invigorating drink could boost morale and restore clarity of thought better than any fiery speech from a commander. It was a sip of energy and warmth amid the cold and fatigue. However, sometimes more powerful means were required. The German army, especially at the beginning of the war during the Blitzkrieg, actively used Pervitin, a methamphetamine-based stimulant. These pills allowed tankers and pilots to go without sleep for 2 to 3 days. Soldiers called Pervitin tank chocolate or stormtrooper pills. It relieved fatigue, increased concentration, and gave a feeling of euphoria and self-confidence. But this temporary cheerfulness came at a terrible price. After the drug wore off, the so-called come down set in. Soldiers felt completely drained, overcome by depression and apathy. Prolonged use caused severe addiction and exhaustion of the nervous system. The Allied command also experimented with amphetamine-based stimulants, but their use was not as widespread. Preference was given to more traditional methods of maintaining alertness. However, in the Air Force and Special Forces, such drugs were used to carry out particularly long and important missions. Do you think the use of such drugs was justified in the extreme conditions of war? But even without stimulants, soldiers found ways to make their sleep safer. In the next chapter, you will learn how they turned their burrows into small fortresses. Even the deepest sleep was useless if soldiers did not feel relatively safe. Therefore, no less attention was paid to setting up a sleeping place than to camouflaging a firing point. Each soldier became an engineer, turning his trench or dugout into a small fortress. The first thing they did was to reinforce the walls and ceiling of the dugout. To do this, they used logs, boards, sandbags, anything that could protect them from bullets and shrapnel. The more reliable the roof over their heads was, the more peaceful their sleep was. They tried to cover the entrance to the dugout, or foxhole. To do this, they used a raincoat, an old sack, or simply a bundle of branches. This improvised door protected not only from the weather, but also from the moonlight or flares that could wake the sleepers. Great attention was paid to drainage. It was impossible to sleep properly in a damp trench, so the soldiers dug special channels to drain the water. They tried to raise the bottom of their sleeping area by building a platform out of branches or boards. To combat rodents, which were a real nuisance in the trenches, the soldiers used their ingenuity. They hung their food bags from the ceiling of the dugout. It was a simple but effective way to preserve their meager supplies. To know in time when the enemy was approaching, soldiers installed simple alarm systems. They stretched thin wire around their positions and tied empty tin cans to it. Anyone who touched the wire at night made a noise that immediately woke the sentries. Strict order was maintained inside the dugout. Weapons were always kept close at hand in a strictly defined place. Every soldier knew that in case of an alarm, he would have only a few seconds to prepare for battle. Chronic sleep deprivation was as much a weapon as artillery or aviation. It did not strike the soldiers' bodies, but their minds, slowly and methodically destroying them from within. The psychological consequences of sleep deprivation were no less dangerous than physical exhaustion. After several days without sleep, the world began to change. Depth of perception disappeared, sounds became muffled, and colors faded. Reality seemed like a dream, and dreams seemed like reality. The soldiers' concentration declined sharply. They could forget an order they had just received or fail to notice obvious danger. Many accidents at the front were caused by mistakes made due to fatigue. Lack of sleep exacerbated emotions. Soldiers became irritable, aggressive, or conversely, apathetic. Any little thing could cause an outburst of anger or tears.
We move out now!
One of the most dangerous consequences was auditory and visual hallucinations. A soldier might think he saw movement in the neutral zone or heard voices. This often led to false alarms and a senseless waste of ammunition. Constant fatigue dulled the instinct for self-preservation. Soldiers ceased to be afraid, not because of bravery, but because of complete indifference. They no longer cared whether they survived or not, as long as it all ended quickly. Commanders understood that an exhausted unit was incapable of fighting. Therefore, great attention was paid to rest. Sometimes the opportunity to sleep for 8 hours was valued more highly than replenishing ammunition. On the Eastern Front in winter, the main enemy was not only the enemy, but also the piercing cold. In conditions where the temperature dropped to minus 30 to 40 degrees, sleeping in the open air was tantamount to suicide. The only way to survive was to use any available source of heat. The most valuable source of heat was another person. Soldiers, both Soviet and German, slept huddled together in a tight group. They lay down in a trench or snowdrift close to each other, creating a collective blanket. This method was known as sleeping in a heap. Soldiers lay on their sides, spooning each other to minimize heat loss. Periodically on command, they all turned over to the other side to warm up evenly. It was warmest in the center of such a group, so places were constantly changing. Those who lay on the edge and were freezing moved to the middle. It was a cruel but fair system based on the principle of mutual assistance. Overcoats and raincoats were used as shared shelter. Several raincoats were tied together to create a large awning under which the whole group could shelter. Under such shelter, the temperature was several degrees higher than outside. Soldiers used chemical warmers when they were available, but more often than not, they had to improvise. Stones heated on a fire were wrapped in cloth and placed under a greatcoat. Such a warmer could provide heat for several hours. Before going to sleep, soldiers tried to eat something hot and high in calories. Hot food not only warmed them from the inside, but also gave the body the energy it needed to maintain body temperature during sleep. The contrast between sleep on the front lines and rest in the rear was enormous. When a battle-weary unit was taken away for reorganization, the soldiers found themselves in a completely different world. Here, sleep turned from a short respite into what it should be, a full recovery of strength. The first sign of life behind the lines was a roof over one's head. The opportunity to sleep in a surviving village hut, barracks, or even a large army tent seemed like the height of comfort. Most importantly, there was no need to fear a shell falling on one's head. Instead of foxholes and dirty bunks, there were real beds, or at least pallets. Soldiers were often given straw-filled mattresses and even pillows. After months of sleeping on the bare ground, it felt like royal luxury. Soldiers could finally take off their heavy ammunition and wet boots. The opportunity to sleep undressed under a real blanket was an almost forgotten sensation from peacetime. Bodies accustomed to constant tension could finally relax. The most important treasure of the rear was long, uninterrupted sleep. Soldiers were allowed to sleep for 8 or even 10 hours straight without having to jump up at an alarm or go on duty. The body, which had been working to exhaustion, eagerly made up for lost time. In the early days at the rear, soldiers could sleep for almost a whole day, waking up only to eat. This was the so-called recovery period, when the body and psyche recovered from the stress they had experienced. Another luxury was the bathhouse. The opportunity to wash off the dirt from the trenches, change clothes, and steam properly worked better than any medicine. A clean body and clean clothes were the key to sound and healthy sleep. We have looked at just a few of the tricks that World War II soldiers used to reclaim their right to sleep from the war. Behind each of these methods, from sleeping standing up to the hotbed, lies not just ingenuity, but the incredible power of the human spirit and its ability to adapt to the most unimaginable conditions. These stories show us another side of war, not the ceremonial side with its bravura marches, but the trench side, where heroism meant simply surviving another night. The experiences of these people are a stark reminder of how fragile peace is and how precious the simple things are that seem like an unattainable dream in the trenches. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in soldiers' food, frontline humor, or other aspects of military life. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the little tricks of big history.